Thank you very much for that introduction. I like the way that you describe my research. I'm going to have to like take notes because it's better than how I do. So I would like to thank everyone at KU for having me back, Ezra in particular for doing all of the organizing for all of these events, and I really deeply appreciate it. So as Eric mentioned, this is a very different project than the one that I presented here last time. This is both a very new project in some ways, but also a very old project. I have long been interested and have studied ever since I was an undergraduate, actually, Central Asian Russian relations. And so since Russia's invasion, which as many of you know or could expect, has fundamentally altered and shaped its relationship with Central Asia, I've gone back and started a new area of research, another area of interest, and what I'll be talking about today is assessing how the publics in Central Asia, particularly those in Kazakhstan and the Kyrgyz Republic, which arguably have the closest relationship with Russia and the closest ties with Russia, how they have responded to and reacted to the war, and how the war has altered their attitudes towards the international community more broadly. So not just the United States, or excuse me, not just Russia, but also the United States, the West, places like China, Turkey, Iran, and the like. And so what I'm presenting to you today is very much incredibly new research. Some of it I've just been kind of working with the data the past couple of weeks. So this is very, very preliminary, and I'm just going to share a lot of thoughts with you today because ultimately the goal of this project is I'm hoping this upcoming summer to field some focus groups and some surveys to look at a lot of these questions that I'm just starting to ask now in much more depth. So I really do have two agendas here today. One is to kind of get your thoughts about ways to expand this, different areas you think might be interesting to look at in more depth. And also another ulterior motive, which is to advertise a symposium that I am organizing next spring in OU on this topic, which you are all very cordially invited to. And so I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. So just a quick overview of the talk. So today I'm going to, as I mentioned, look at broad strokes, some of the initial findings from a couple of policy briefs that I've authored in an academic paper that's right now under review. As I said, these are very much first steps and what I anticipate being a pretty long-term, pretty big project. So I'm going to start by talking briefly about Russia's relationship with Kazakhstan and the Kyrgyz Republic, as well as some factors and correlates that academics and researchers expect might influence how people think about relationships with other countries and foreign affairs and current events. Focusing specifically on kind of two areas of attitudes. First, views of the war, of Russia's war against Ukraine specifically, and then more broadly, attitudes towards international community and specific foreign powers. And that's how this talk is going to go. So very briefly, what does Central Asian Russian relations look like? First, Central Asia, of course, is made up of many different countries, each of which have their own very unique relationship with Russia, and I'll talk about Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan today. But in broad strokes, ever since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Russia has in many ways served as one of Central Asia's primary external security partners and is viewed by many in the region, governments and citizens alike, as a security guarantor. Russia makes up about 2/3 of all arms exports in the region, and they also extensively engage in joint military exercises and exchanges in bilateral alliances, things like the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, and the Commonwealth of Independent States. Moreover, Russia is also a very important economic partner for Central Asia, although this is very much an area that we have seen some decline over time, and in particular emergence of other foreign partners such as China, Turkey, Iran, and the like. Perhaps even more importantly, however, Russia is also the primary destination country for Central Asian migrants. So in 2019, so pre-pandemic, although it looks like figures surprisingly roughly stayed the same, nearly 10 million Central Asians were officially registered as migrants in Russia. And that's official statistics, so most likely the actual number of this is much, much larger. And remittances, so the money that migrants send back to Central Asia, to their homes and to their families, remain a very important source of economic wealth for some of the Central Asian states, particularly the Kyrgyz Republic and Tajikistan as well, which are two of the most remittance-dependent countries in the world. So in the past couple of years, about a third of Kyrgyzstan's GDP came from remittances from migration to Russia and other parts of the world. Finally, Russia has a really strong cultural and symbolic importance in the region. Russian language enjoys official status in many of the countries and is very widely spoken in the region. Russian media is a very prominent player in Kyrgyzstan, actually. Two of Russia's state media channels were two of the three most popular media channels in the country. So Russian media is quite important. And these symbolic relationships matter because Russia has, both in the past and today, pointed to Central Asia as evidence that it is a great power because they have this, quote, natural sphere of influence abroad. To be very clear, that's pretty derogatory, both terms, but also way to perceive independent sovereign nations. But this nonetheless is how Russia often views Central Asia. And Central Asia is important in Russia's imagination of itself as a great power because, in comparison to, say, other former Soviet states, like in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, Central Asia has much more limited prospects of joining, say, NATO and the EU, and otherwise building dense ties with the West. So in some ways, Central Asia is, quote unquote, safer as a sphere of influence for Russia. So given all these ties, it really should come as no surprise to everybody in this room that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 reverberated throughout the region and had pretty important implications. So first, before I get really into the meat of this talk about public attitude and public opinion, I want to talk a little bit about how Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, how they have responded to the war, right? So instead of thinking about Russia's relationship with these countries from a Russia perspective, let's think about why this war matters from the Central Asian perspective. So first off, let's talk about Kazakhstan. Weeks before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Russian-backed Collective Security Treaty Organization, again the CSTO, deployed troops in Kazakhstan to quell domestic unrest. So there was a period in January known as Kambi Kamtar, or Bloody January, which were a series of protests that happened in the country. And the CSTO troops, or peacekeepers as they call themselves, helped President Tokayev, so the current president of Kazakhstan, secure his hold on power. As a result of this, in the early days of Russia's invasion, if you turned on any news, read any analysis about how Russia's invasion would influence Central Asia, almost unanimously you would hear, well, Kazakhstan is going to come out in support of Russia because they are really dependent on Russia due to its support of the government during the Bloody January. This was not the case, right? Kazakhstan has arguably taken the strongest stance against the war of all of its Central Asian neighbors. It was the first country in the region to publicly come out and state that they would not recognize the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. They have consistently reaffirmed Ukraine's sovereignty. They have sent aid to Ukraine, have spoken multiple times with Zelensky, and so have taken a much stronger stance than most international observers thought going into this war. Moreover, throughout the war, the Kazakhstani government has in many ways kind of continued to distance itself from Russia's aggression and to further diversify its other ties with political and economic ties and partners, both within the region and outside the region, while at the same time balancing and maintaining a bilateral relationship with Moscow. So actually economic trade and relations between Kazakhstan and Russia have increased quite a bit since the war compared to before the war, as Russia has lost access to international markets and become increasingly isolated from the international community. And this response reflects Kazakhstan's official multi-vector policy is what they call it, in which they try to balance relations with countries around the world, both in the region and without. So, in addition to this, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its war against Ukraine has particular resonance in the country due to the domestic political landscape, and specifically the presence of quite a large ethnic Russian minority population that exists in the country. So in northern Kazakhstan, there's a kind of a grouping of ethnic Russians that make up about 15% of the total population in the country. This is by far the highest in the region. And this population has stoked fears, and we've heard this both from people within the region and the government and society, but also in the international community, fears of a potential quote-unquote Russian fifth column, essentially a group that is sympathetic to Russia's imperial ambitions in the countries. And these fears have very much been fueled by the rhetoric of the Russian government and the Russian media, which has consistently questioned the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the country. So, for example, both President Putin and former President Medvedev have claimed that the Kazakhs have no history of statehood. They have, members of the Duma have talked about Kazakhstan, present-day Kazakhstan being a gift from Russia. So similar rhetoric to what we saw leading up to Ukraine, right? Denying its statehood, denying its sovereignty. So that's Kazakhstan, kind of leading up into the war. Kyrgyzstan, however, is quite a different picture in many ways. Kyrgyzstan's relationship with Russia is characterized much more than in Kazakhstan by significant economic and political dependence. Politically, the Kyrgyz Republic maintains pretty close ties with Moscow and is generally considered perhaps the most Russia-friendly country or government in the region. Oops. Economically, as I mentioned previously, Kyrgyzstan is one of the world's most remittance-dependent economies, with remittances equaling over 30% of the GDP. There's also a really large Kyrgyz migrant population in Russia. Official statistics put this at about 20%, but again, this is most likely an undercount. And given this relative reliance of the Kyrgyz Republic and their government on Russia, this is kind of reflected in the government's more neutral stance to the war in comparison to Kazakhstan. So right after the invasion, like a couple of hours after the invasion, President Chapman comes out on social media and expresses some type of support for Russia's escalation, only to quickly walk those comments back and declare the country's neutrality in the conflict. But still, the overall response has been relatively ambivalent, I would say. On one hand, the Kyrgyzstani government has banned any type of anti-war demonstrations, allegedly due to pressure from Moscow and from the Kremlin. However, at the same time, authorities have refrained from endorsing the war and have, again, repeatedly affirmed the right of every country to self-determination. So we see much more of a balancing act coming out of Kyrgyzstan than Kazakhstan. So, why do we care, right? So my personal interest, I am a scholar of public opinion and political behavior. I'm always interested in how government relates to the masses and how masses react to different events. So the question that I ask in this project is, how has the war influenced how the Kyrgyzstani and Kazakhstani publics have reacted to the war and how it's influenced their public opinion? I think this is a very important question because despite really long-held skepticism in the academic literature, what is known as the Almond-Littman consensus, we even have a term for this, there is increasingly a large body of work that demonstrates that public opinion is actually very consequential for foreign affairs of countries, both in democracies and non-democracies alike. Right? Individuals in non-democracies such as Kazakhstan often hold very strong views of foreign affairs and foreign policy decisions, particularly things such as the war, things that resonate a lot with these audiences, and they express these opinions through a lot of formal and informal channels. So as a result, the evidence suggests that authoritarian regimes not only care about what the public thinks, but can also suffer from various costs if they don't pay attention and react to how their publics are thinking about various foreign events. So that being said, the question then becomes, well, what has been the impact of the war on public opinion? How have people viewed the war, and how do they view now their relationship with different countries given the war? So that is what I'll be answering today. Just for the sake of ease, I kind of divide up attitudes as thinking about those as pro-Russian attitudes, either views of the war that reflect the Russian government's narratives and messaging, or things like favorability towards Russia during the war. And I'll talk about that a lot more in a little bit. So to answer this question, I'm initially starting, this is kind of, again, when I say this is first steps, I'm starting with data from the Central Asia Barometer, which is the largest survey organization in the region. I can give you more details about this, but I'm focusing on 2 waves of surveys for some of them. So basically the wave right before the war, November, December, and the wave right after the war in May and June. As I said, I'm really taking this as a first cut so that I can learn from and find out where kind of some of the interesting things are that we need to think about in more depth, so that I can go ahead and field my own surveys next year in the upcoming summers. So let's start by looking at views of the war. How do people in Central Asia assess the view of the war? Here are some just initial overview results. I'm relying on 3 different variables here. So first, whether or not people think that this war, or as they had to be used in the survey, the special military operation, whether or not it is justified, who they see as being responsible for the conflict, and then how they think the conflict might end. And so these 3 variables essentially capture 2 things. One, overall attitudes, like how favorable they are towards Russia, like are they blaming Ukraine instead of Russia for the conflict? Do they think that the war is justified? As well as adherence to Russian messaging around the war. Like, Russian messaging is like, Russia's going to come in and we're going to win. Ukraine has no hope. And so do they adhere to that type of messaging? One thing to note, as you might have figured out from reading these questions, given the sensitivity of this topic, the Central Asia Barometer did not use the word war anywhere in their surveys. They used euphemisms such as special military operation, the situation in Ukraine, and the conflict in Ukraine. That being said, I'm calling a spade. We're going to be talking about this in terms of the war, right? And what we see right off the bat is that there's pretty large, variation in how people view the war and attitudes towards the war. Overall, respondents in Kyrgyzstan are much more likely to adhere to narratives forwarded by the Russian government than respondents in Kazakhstan. They are more likely, in general, to think that the war is justified. They're more likely to blame Ukraine for the war and less likely to blame Russia. And they're just generally more likely to think that the war is going to end in Russia's favor. Right? Another thing that I think is really interesting, and I'm starting to dive into a little bit more, is how many people say that they don't know, that they don't have a clear answer to this question. In some cases, it's close to 1/3 of all respondents. I think that's fascinating, and I'm trying to figure out a little bit more about what's going on there. So that's my first set of variables. Then my second set is looking at the extent to which the percentage of people who say that they have favorable attitudes towards different countries. So I'm looking primarily for Russia, United States, China, and Iran. Very briefly, there's a couple of, I think, interesting things just looking at this. First, we can see is that favorability towards Russia decreased substantially following the full-scale invasion. So from the first of these bars to the second and third of these bars. Overall, this decline was much more noticeable in Kazakhstan, so like 17% versus about 11%, but soon returned, at least in the case of Kyrgyzstan, to pre-war levels. So we see this quick dip where there's a quick recovery. But at the same time as favorability towards Russia is declining, we see an increase in positive views towards other powers such as China and Iran. So we see these pretty large increases in favorability, meaning people have more positive views of these countries after the war than before, right? And this is kind of intuitive, right? Russia is seen as one of the major economic and political partners in Central Asia, but also proved themselves pretty untrustworthy in this role with the invasion, leading the public to look towards other potential partners for their countries. And then finally, if we look at views in the United States, it's interesting that they remained relatively stable. There's some dips and stuff, but these do not meet conventional levels of statistical significance. So despite the Russian government and the Russian media's attempt to put the blame on the West and the United States for the war, there's actually limited evidence just from overall that attitudes changed at all following the invasions. So this part of the data I'm really just getting into. A lot of this is very preliminary. And just for the sake of time today, I'm going to look at favorability towards Russia specifically. But I'd be happy to chat more about these other aspects. So, what factors influence these geopolitical preferences? That is, what correlates, what factors are related to Russia's narratives or worldviews. What these I'm calling, again, pro-Russian views for short. So prior research argues that an individual's geopolitical preferences, how they view the world, is often going to hinge on personal, economic, and social connections to a country and exposure to that country's media. So given the close political, economic, and cultural ties between Russia and Central Asia, we may expect that some of the main factors that could be correlated with attitudes towards Russia, and again, these overall pro-Russian attitudes, would be things like ethno-linguistic identity, migration and remittances, and media use. So all three of these variables collectively reinforce personal connections to foreign countries, in this case, specifically Russia, and can shape political attitudes through cultural, economic, and informational ties due to the close cultural and social proximity between Russia and Central Asia. So I'm going to talk about the logic of each of these individually, and after which I'm going to go through some of the main results of each of these three areas. So let's start with ethno-linguistic identity. So as I mentioned previously, Russia's war against Ukraine has really intensified concerns about support for Russia among ethnic Russian and Russian-speaking populations throughout Eurasia, particularly in Kazakhstan, but in general in Central Asia too. There's this sense that these groups may be particularly sympathetic to Russian messaging, may identify more closely with Russia, and again, all of this rhetoric has been very much fueled by the Russian government and the state media. And so it's reasonable to assume or to expect that people with close cultural ties to Russia are going to be more likely to accept Russia's messaging around these major current events and generally have just a more positive attitude of Russia, right? But at the same time, there's actually been pretty mixed evidence in the literature itself to show that these variables are really related, or at least consistently related, with pro-Russian political preferences. Moreover, we know that language does not equal ethnicity, right? These are very different things, and they have very different implications for attitudes. And so we need to disaggregate them and look at these things separately. So to do this, I follow best practices in existing literature, and I'm looking at mainly three main variables: ethnicity, so their self-reported ethnicity, either Russian ethnicity or a titular group, so this is Kazakh, the Kazakh in Kazakhstan, the Kyrgyz in Kyrgyzstan, and so on. Language embeddedness, that is the extent to which they speak a particular language within their communities, at home with their friends. And then also language preference. Which language do they personally want, like, speak in normally? So this is the language which they chose to take the interview. Everybody had a choice. And what we expect just overall is that ethnic Russians and people who speak Russian in their communities or at home are going to be more likely to hold overall pro-Russian attitudes than those who don't fit into these groups. Okay, so what do we find? I'm going to go through, I have a lot of results. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly for time's sake, but happy to talk more about them. So for all of these tables that I'm going to show you, what I'm showing you is the predicted probabilities, essentially the percent of each of these groups, in this case, ethnic groups, either Russian ethnic groups or titular ethnic groups, the percent of them who state each of these answers for each of these three questions. I also have the change between, the difference between Russian and titular groups. Those that are green are ones that actually are significant, that we think are making, have a difference. Those that do not have a color do not. So what we see for the most part is pretty strong support for the notion that Russian ethnicity is correlated with holding more pro-Russian war views. Particularly though in Kazakhstan, where we see a substantively larger and more consistent difference between ethnicity, Russian ethnic groups, and titular ethnic groups. So all else equal, ethnic Russians are less likely to blame Russia for the conflict. They're more likely to believe that the war is justified, less likely to think that it's not justified, and also more likely to think that the war is going to end in Russia's favor. So with like Ukraine accepting Russia's terms and Russia retreating. What's also interesting here is that like I said, I'm really just in these don't knows. There's really no difference for people like not having any strong attitudes, which I think is interesting and something I want to explore further. So I then look at language embeddedness as well as language preference. So Russian language embeddedness, language preference for each of them. Same interpretation of the data here. And what we see is overall generally more mixed results. We see a lot more variation in issue area as well as differences between political contexts. So overall, language preference, so what language they chose to take the interview in, is more consistently associated with views of the war in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. People who chose to speak Russian are much more likely to blame the West for the conflict, less likely to blame Russia, and less likely to think that the war is justified. Counterintuitively, however, we also see that Russian speakers here are actually more likely to think that Russia will retreat. If you look here, which is quite interesting. I haven't quite figured out what is going on there, so if anybody has any ideas, please do let me know. In Kazakhstan, we see both main measures of language are associated with thinking that the war is justified and with expecting that that Ukraine will accept Russia's terms as well. So overall, what these results tell us is that we really do, first off, need to disaggregate different measures of ethno-linguistic identity. Language is not ethnicity, these are not the same things, but that there's a lot more nuance within attitudes and that differences across political context as well. So I'd be happy to talk about that more. Then very briefly, I also look at this favorability towards Russia. So here the interpretation is a little bit different. It's still the percentage of each of these groups, so titular groups, Russian language groups. But here I'm looking prior to the war and then after the war. So here it's the change over time. It's not just the differences between groups. And so what we know is overall views of Russia were depressed after the war. So what becomes interesting is when we see that there are major differences among, say, titular groups and Russian groups. So like, let's look at language embeddedness, right? Both decrease by 10% favorability. So no particular group is driving the relationship here. But then if we look at ethnicity, what we see here is that for both Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, overall, Russians here are becoming much less supportive of Russia in Kazakhstan, and they're becoming alternatively much more supportive of Russia in Kyrgyzstan. So we see opposite relationships, and we see the results being driven by Russian ethnic groups, not titular ethnic groups. This is really, I think, quite fascinating. And I have some anecdotal evidence that kind of makes me understand this a little bit better, and I'd be happy to talk about that too. So that's our results primarily for ethnicity. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed through things a little bit more quickly. But second, I'm looking at remittances and migration. So according to previous scholarship, economic dependence in Russia should also play a role in shaping attitudes. As I mentioned, Russia has long been one of the primary destination countries for migrant workers in Central Asia. And migration in the previous research has been shown to closely align with political attitudes towards the towards the host country. So overall, migration is associated with a greater sense of affinity with the host country, as well as more exchange of information that means that migrants are more likely to hold views in line with the host country's political values than those who do not migrate. However, we also know migrant experiences vary quite a bit. This is particularly true for the case of Central Asians and Russia, many of whom face pretty unequal treatment within the country. So in order to understand this relationship between migration, or more particularly remittances, and political attitudes, I look at whether or not the household receives any of their income from foreign remittances and the importance of foreign remittances. And here we might expect that individuals with households that receive remittances and receive a lot of remittances, they're going to be more likely to hold pro-Russian attitudes than those that do not. So what do we see? Overall, not a lot, interestingly enough. Despite or against existing work, there's not a ton of evidence that remittances really matter for political attitudes surrounding the war. It doesn't really seem to be doing that much in general. Now, to be fair, I think there's a lot of weaknesses in this particular measure. It really doesn't capture this differences in experience with migration, and remittances are kind of, not the most robust measure of a person's entire experience with migration. So this is an area I think for future work, there's a lot to be done here, just given the not so great measures for what we have now. However, when we look at favorable attitudes towards Russia, we actually see a little bit stronger and more interesting results. Again, because we're looking over time, it's more interesting to look at differences amongst, between the two groups. And so what we see here is favorability declines for both the people who think remittances are important and for those for whom it's not important, but is most substantial for people who do not rely a lot on remittances. This makes intuitive sense, right? Individuals that are not reliant on Russia for economic support and who presumably are not quite as exposed to Russia's messaging due to migration experience a smaller dip in favorability, or excuse me, a larger dip in favorability as due to the war. And then finally, very briefly, I want to look at media use. This is really where most of my research is, and something that I'm planning on doing a lot more in the future. So theories of international media suggest that foreign media are going to have the strongest impact on attitudes for contexts that specifically have high degrees of political and cultural resonance and value proximity. That is, such as Russian media in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, where Russian media has a really large audiences. That being said, recent research, including a lot of my own research, kind of throws doubt on this idea that media influences and impacts public opinions of foreign audiences. And I show in work that Russian television and traditional media has at best a very conditional and mixed impact on support for Russia and general favorability towards Russia. So in order to look at this, I use the primary source of information that people use for international news. And here we would expect that people who rely more on Russian television and other news sources would be more likely to hold pro-Russian attitudes than those that do not. So what we see here is, in some ways, pretty consistent results with that expectation. Although, again, we see some differences between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. In both of these countries, we see expected patterns of people who consume Russian media being more likely to agree with and adhere to Russian narratives surrounding the war, particularly when they consider things like whether or not the war is justified or unjustified. So here, media seems to be a little bit more aligned than maybe some previous research suggests. We also see pretty interesting results for favorability. So here we see is that for both countries, favorability declines for people who use domestic media and the internet, but not for Russian news. So first you're like, okay, so I guess Russian media isn't doing anything. But I think a better interpretation is that we know favorability towards Russia declined in both countries. So the fact that we're not seeing a similar decline for Russian news media users shows that in some ways Russian media is almost insulating these people from the impact from other narratives around the war. So the fact that we don't see a decline among Russian media users despite this overall decline in favorability suggests that there is some relationship between media use and political attitudes. So while this may be a little bit alarming perhaps at first, the good news, or the interesting news at the very least, is that there has been a really sharp decline in the number of people who turn to Russian news since the invasion. So I started studying Russian media in Central Asia back in 2013 and 2014. At that point, about 60% of the population turned to Russian news every single day. It's their main source of news about the world, and actually about their own country as well. After the war, we saw this go down to about 10%. So a pretty massive decline. This wasn't all due to the war. There had been a decline over time. But what we see is overall, Russian news media is just not as prevalent or as prominent in Central Asia as it once was. So though there does seem to be a pretty strong correlation or relationship between political attitudes and using Russian media, this is going to be increasingly for a much smaller portion of the population just due to declining influence of Russian media in the region. So this is something I really want to explore more of. I also want to explore a lot more about the specifics of Russian messaging surrounding the war. So beyond just attitudes, what is Russian media actually saying about the war? And so that's one of my next steps as well. Okay, so I'm about out of time, so I just want to I know throw a lot of information at you today, so kind of just summing up some of the major things that we're seeing. First, we see is that public opinion in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan in many ways seems to reflect each country's positioning vis-a-vis Russia and the resonance of the invasion for their own country. In Kazakhstan, we see a pretty strong and, for some analysts, I'm sure, concerning connection between personal ties and networks and pro-Russian attitudes, which reflect, this pretty large ethnic Russian population and Russian-speaking population in the country. In Kyrgyzstan, while these ethno-linguistic identity is important, pro-Russian attitudes are much more instrumental, right? They reflect much broader factors than identity in these countries. So we see also pretty mixed relationship for the importance of remittances. This goes against a lot of existing work in political science and sociology, And so that's something I think deserves a lot more explanation and a lot more research in this area. Finally, reflecting a lot of my earlier work, Russian media does seem to be correlated with political attitudes, but there's some important caveats, particularly the overall declining influence of Russian media in the region. And so this is another area that I think we need to explore further. So given, I think, the current limitations, there's a lot of things that can be done, and I'd be really thrilled to hear like if there's any other directions you think would be useful to really look at. First, I want to be clear, these data aren't telling any type of causal relationship. We're not saying Russian media is leading to public attitudes or whatnot, just that there is some type of relationship between them. So in my next steps, I'm going to be trying to get more at this causal question. I also want to focus more on this ethnic Russian community and these Russian speakers, given this, so-called concern about Russian fifth column. We just don't see a lot of these people appearing in the data, so I really want to look at this population in particular. So that is kind of one of the next steps I'm going to do. But overall, this project is what I'm concerned about and what I really care about for this project is pushing to recenter the strategic interests and the perspectives of the countries in Central Asia, right, of these so-called secondary states. So much in our study of international politics, we like to focus on great powers and look at how great powers influence other countries, as opposed to looking at how these countries have their own agency, their own strategic objectives, and things that they are trying to achieve. So I think a lot of the expectations about how Central Asia would respond to the war, this very much came from a Russia-centric worldview that really wasn't looking at the agency and the interest of these countries. So my goal in this research is to recenter this object of study, to really look at Central Asia as the agents, as the center of study rather than Russia. And so that leads me to my little plug that I came here for in part, which is that I am hosting a symposium specifically on this topic at the University of Oklahoma in the spring. So we are going to look at how countries in Eurasia, so not just Central Asia, but the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, and the like as well, how they have responded to the war, both from government side of things, but also from society's perspective as well. I believe Ezra sent around a call for proposals that I put out, and I would be thrilled if anybody wants to come or propose a paper or just attend and listen in. This is something I'm really excited about, and I hope to see some of you there. Great. So I'll end at that. I know we don't have too much time left, but I am really open to any questions or thoughts you all have.
Thank you so much, Hannah. And this will also be going out through our priest email list. So if you haven't signed up for that, please do that. Yeah, we do have about 15 minutes for questions. You want to field your own questions?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yeah.
So in the beginning, you mentioned that Russia was a security guarantor for both Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. They're both part of CSTO.
Mm-hmm.
Could a potential future extension be looking at, for example, Turkmenistan, which was never a member of CSTO, and Uzbekistan, who was a former member, to maybe see how the effect of membership in CSTO could affect approval of Russia?
Yeah, I mean, that is a great question. I know that, Pauline Jones and Regina Smith are actually working on this very question right now. My research experience is very much in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, so I personally don't know if I will be expanding to other countries, but that is a really interesting question, and unfortunately there are people working on that. So yeah, stay tuned. I know they're kind of in the beginning stages of that, but it's going to be really cool once it comes out. It's a great question, yeah.
Do you have a sense in the before and after
Yeah.
the war with regard to Russian responses within, say, Kazakhstan? Do you have a
Yep.
sense of how citizenship plays in? I mean, some of the flight people running away from conscription are obviously going to have a very different attitude about Russia and their role in the war, perhaps, than people Russians who have been living in Kazakhstan the whole time.
Yeah. So that is a really great question. This is specifically looking at Kazakhstanis. So I should not be capturing the migrants coming in to Russia. that is also, I think, though, another really interesting question, is because we do know that there is quite a bit of difference between, obviously, even that they're ethnic Russian, but they were born in Kazakhstan, their family was born in Kazakhstan, they've been here for a very long time. Their identity is going to look very, very different than migrants coming in trying to flee the war. And so this, I think, is another area that a lot of people, the government, our government, is really interested in asking, is how these new migrants are changing a lot of these dynamics, right? There's already been this ongoing discourse about decolonizing Central Asia and their, like, how they perceive Russia, right? No longer thinking of Russia as some benevolent big brother that Russia always tries to say, but realizing that Russia was a colonizer, right? What does that mean for us? What does that mean for our identities? We've seen a lot of ethnic Russians, as well as the new migrants coming in, actively trying to learn Kazakh for many of them for the first time. When I lived in Kazakhstan, I came all prepared to speak Kazakh, and everyone was like, no, we're just going to speak Russian, it's easier, right? We're seeing a change. And I think that's really exciting and really positive, but it's an open question about how that could impact political attitudes. And so, yeah, I think that's another really interesting
Yeah, and the impact of those people on the ethnic Russians who live
Yeah.
there, because they're gonna be having conversations.
Right,
Why'd
yeah.
you leave? Well, I don't believe it. Oh, really? No, that kind of thing could really shift the way people think.
That's a really great point. Yeah, that would be interesting. I'm going to see if that is something we can look at as well to get both the populations. Yeah.
Thank you. So that was one of my questions too, but just to clarify, so is it citizenship that Central Asian Barometer has as the determining factor for whether they survey people?
So they ask a number of probing questions to figure out if you are, should be one of the ones taking it. And it's basically you have to be there at least long-term residents. So it wouldn't be any of these new people. Also, the surveys that I'm looking at, this was right after the war. And so while there were, of course, Russians who fled right after the war, the majority of the people fleeing the country came in September after mobilization as well. So even, the ethnic Russians in the north are such a small portion of this survey data, which is, I think, one of the reasons why I want to do it myself is to really probe this. But yeah, from my understanding, we don't have any of that population in there. Or at least if we do, I can't identify them.
Okay, thank you. And then, so the other thing I was going to ask, a bigger question, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the political context in Kyrgyzstan, because you mentioned how for Kazakhstan, there's all of this rhetorical animosity coming from the Russian government about the direction that Kazakhstan's been going for several years now, right? And Kyrgyzstan for so long, relative to its neighbors, was going in a relatively more pro-democratic direction, right? And then we've seen such a backsliding of that, this like crackdown on independent media. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how much of that is motivated by a sentiment of dependence on the Russian government, or just like an internal sense within the Kazakh government of needing to like centralize and like establish their power vertical more strongly, and kind of how that might be impacting the differences that we're seeing in the survey data.
You mean the Kyrgyz?
Yeah, in Kyrgyz.
Okay,
Sorry, I
Kyrgyzstan.
forgot what I said.
So how this might be impacting the public opinion that we're seeing?
Yeah.
So if we look specifically at public opinion, the results from Kyrgyzstan, they are very similar to what we saw much prior to the war, even prior to this current government. So I do think a lot of the results that we're seeing are due to these factors, like those Russian linking factors, ethno-linguistic identity, economic dependence. I think those are really what's driving here. The government's reaction to the war, however, I think is much more bound up in the current regime and their own political insecurities. So Japadov had a pretty rocky relationship with Russia going into the war. This was a point of contention for him, and he had been trying to find ways to make Russia more sympathetic to him so that they could help reinforce his power. I don't know if he has succeeded, but I do think we really need to consider the agency of the government and their attempts to essentially retain their hold on power. Yeah. Good question. Anton.
So I'm curious about your thinking on this three factors that you looked at: ethnicity, I guess, for language, remittances, and the use of Russian media. So clearly there's probably a lot of overlap between these factors. And I think with this sample, I don't think it's possible to really disentangle, but I'm just curious about your thinking. Is there really something specifically about the media or specifically about the language, or is it more like we just have 2 or 3 groups that cluster around this 3, 4 things, right? And they differ in how they react to the war. And then the second question is sort of more going forward. So you mentioned at the end that countries have agencies and they have strategic interests, right? So if we do see these changes of opinion, do they reflect more the strategic interest on the part of the government, right? Or is it more like how citizens genuinely react to the war? And again, I know you cannot answer that right now, but just going forward, I think it's interesting.
No, I think both of these questions are ones that I don't have an answer to, right? And this is really a weakness of the data, and as in large part motivating why I think we need to do more on this in the future. Based off of my prior work, where I have been able to get at some of these questions in a bit more detail, there is not as strong of a correlation between, say, using Russian media and migrating to Russia as one might expect. Language is kind of the unifying factor here for obvious reasons, right? It's much easier for you to actually go and work in Russia if you can speak Russian, and you're going to only be watching Russian television if you don't understand Russian to be able to watch it, right? But there's surprisingly not as strong overlap than the other factors. I do think, particularly in the case of Kyrgyzstan, my prior work calls into question how important it is in of these other factors like language and economic remittances. These results make it look a lot stronger, but I personally kind of question that exactly for the very reason that you mentioned. So again, another really important avenue that I hope to tease out in the future. As opposed to your second question, to what extent is this the citizens kind of adhering to the government messaging versus just a reaction of citizens to, the general environment? I don't know, that's a great question. It's probably a little bit of both. The fact that we do see such different results between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan lead me to believe it's perhaps more about the overall relationship between these countries rather than the strategic objectives of their government in particular. But this is particularly hard to tease out in the case of Kazakhstan because, so I mentioned earlier, like at the beginning of the presentation, about 3 weeks before, I guess, the invasion, Kazakhstan had a series of protests this bloody January. I think a lot of this could be reacting to those events as well, right? If you look at the timing, 2 big things happened between these 2 survey waves. The war, but also the protests. And so it's even more difficult to parse this out in that case. I feel a little bit more confident in the case of Kyrgyzstan, but Kazakhstan is very much the major question mark here for me.
I wanted to unpack this category of media a little bit, especially since you've worked on media a lot, and what's sort of lurking below those 3 categories.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, I'm wondering about domestic media, whether there are significant Russophone domestic media sources that are in how that might be operating, and also with internet. I mean, internet is so big, and people might not know where their news is coming from, especially with social media, which is drawing stories from all kinds of things. And then there's obviously sort of stories that cross over, cross borders, and not even talking about sort of Russian sort of efforts to sort of inject disinformation, but just sort of what's going on in those 2 categories and how you might get at that a little bit more.
Yeah, that is another fantastic question. The only one of these categories that really are coherent in any way is the Russian media, right? For exactly those reasons. We have no idea what's going on here. A friend of mine in the State Department is working on this question of like when we look at social media use, what sources are people using? And every time I talk to him, it seems like he has more questions than he has answers. This is the ultimate struggle of studying media use, is we don't know what's going on, particularly here. We know very well what's going on here, which is why I always like to focus on the Russian media as opposed to any of the others. Domestic media, on the other hand, is fascinating. So let me talk about Kyrgyzstan, because I think that one is the clearest to understand. Kyrgyzstan's domestic media is very underfunded and very underdeveloped, particularly in comparison to like Kazakhstan's media environment in many ways. And because they don't have either the resources or the capacity to do a lot of reporting of their own, they rely on other sources, foreign sources, usually Russian sources, for their coverage. Anton and I are actually talking exactly about this yesterday. So what we see a lot in the Kyrgyzstani coverage of particularly international events such as the news is they will either copy word for word from Russian sources to show that they are covering these events, or they will change the word, paraphrase, probably would still get caught by Turnitin, would be my guess if you really looked through it. But a lot of their coverage therefore reflects other countries' coverage, usually Russian, but we do see, I see similar headlines for like BBC, Voice of America, and others. So it's a lot more disparate. It's a lot more competing voices in the domestic media environment than in the Russian media news outlets that we're seeing. Yeah. So another area where I really want to look more into and see if we can actually get at this a little bit better than we can right here.
I think you touched on this a little bit in your lecture, but seeing as like Russia is part of both Europe and Asia, what made you specifically choose like to do this speech on the relationships with Asia?
Can you rephrase that? I'm trying to get at the core. Yeah.
So Russia is in both continents of Europe and Asia, but what made you draw to like do this speech over like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan rather than like countries in Europe?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of it is, well, it's because of my own research interest and my own research experience. I started studying Central Asia before I ever started studying Russia. I've always been kind of really interested in the Central Asian environment. But the reason why I'm interested in Russian Central Asian relations is exactly the reasons that I talked about right at the beginning of this talk. So often when we look at international relations between countries, it's usually between great powers in many ways. But given the unique relationship of Russia being, the internal security guarantor, their long history in the Soviet Union, and how Russia perceives Central Asia as being their natural sphere of influence, I think it's important to look at how this relationship has evolved over time and what Russia's other international relations, such as exploring here and Ukraine, what that means for this area. Yeah, great question.
Does it mean anything significant? What's at stake? It seems like you've measured the change in sentiment, but what power does that sentiment hold?
That's a great question. Yeah, so we go back kind of to, not right there. So this is a merging area, I think, of research with a lot of people, particularly in the past, and a lot of scholars would be like, who cares about public opinion for foreign affairs? It doesn't matter, right? Authoritarian regimes don't care what their people think. They don't invest at all about public opinion, particularly for issues outside of their country on foreign affairs. There's increasing evidence that is not true. That governments, if they don't pay attention to their citizens' opinions about foreign affairs, they exhibit audience costs. We can see a decrease in legitimacy, a decrease in support, more domestic unrest, particularly when the issues at hand are so closely related to like concerns within the country. So in this case, large Russian ethnic populations, Russian government rhetoric about the sovereignty of these countries.
I'm sorry, but when I don't mean to interrupt you, but at the end of the day, of what concern is it to the powers that be? So it sounds like Russia would be the power in the area. and then they could be losing influence due to waning sentiment despite their efforts through media. Do they have? Is there an economic cost? Okay, people are migrating. Resource costs. They're upset about the war. What is it? What is the tipping point? You know, do we have any of those answers?
So I have two answers to that question. The first is that for me, Russia is not the power that be. I am specifically trying to reorient away from Russia as the object of study and to these countries as an object of study. So as I was saying earlier, these governments care about what their citizens think for their own domestic stability, their own domestic legitimacy. So this is of import to Kazakhstan's government, to Kyrgyzstan's government in particular, right? If we want to look at why this matters for Russia, one of the things that Russia has always done to try to expand its influence is focusing on, soft power, cultural proximity on these ties. They see themselves as a cultural superpower, not just a military superpower, an economic superpower, but specifically as a cultural superpower, right? What we're seeing is that a lot of the things that they've invested in over time, in the media, in a lot of their international narratives, are perhaps failing in some ways. That they're actually hurting, or not they're hurting, but we see less support for Russia overall, which calls into question, their influence in what they see as their sphere of influence around the world.
Do they have
Okay,
any
sorry,
bargaining
we're
power?
out of time, but I do want to thank Dr. Hannah Chapman for a wonderful talk. I do recommend her book, which has a lot more sort of on this subject of information management.
Yeah.
Really, I want to thank her for sharing her new research, and we might have some time to chat afterwards, but we do have to sort of end right now. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.